Yes, my name is Ulrike Dinger. Diana already said that, and I work at the Heidelberg University in the Department of Psychosomatic Medicine. I'm a psychotherapy researcher with the background of a psychologist and an MD, and I have collaborated in previous projects with IFOTES around the subjects of helping skills and on how to acquire and also how to measure helping skills. And that was also my part in the MonaLiSa project. I was responsible for output 1, and together with a co-worker and postdoc in my group, we developed a questionnaire that I'm about to tell you now. Just a few words about the agenda. So, and then of course I will present the questionnaire itself with the items that we developed and chose, so that you get an idea, everyone gets an idea of how we attempt to measure these listening skills. Now, as Diana already said, the overall goal of the MonaLiSa project was the development of a tool in the form of an online platform to self-assess and improve listening skills. Yes, and as part of this overall tool, one sort of important step was the way to measure before we develop the platform and before we develop learning nuggets to improve listening skills. First, we had to find out what we exactly wanted to measure. So what sort of facets or aspects of listening skills there are in order for us to measure them, and then you know, what is the best way to measure them, what are the best questions to ask if one wants to assess listening skills. And so with the beginning of the project, the first meeting we had was in Hagen in October 2019. That was still before Corona, so we met in person with everyone, and there we had, as part of this meetings with all the project partners, we split up into discussion groups, and in these groups we talked, or the experts talked about what do we mean by listening skills. We asked them to sort of come up with different aspects that they find important, and we also agreed between the project partners that the way we would measure is not an objective competence measure, for example, by that have been done in other contexts, but what we actually wanted is for participants to self-assess how comfortable they feel or how competent they feel they are in different aspects of listening skills, because we feel that that is for an online platform the most feasible assessment of measurement, and also something that may change during after training. We then discussed among the group how we could best ask experts and novices about listening skills, and sort of came up with an assessment plan. And then in the following months, in November and December 2019, we did a few phone interviews on listening skills. We interviewed volunteers and experts in the form of test trainers from three countries that were involved in the project. And we also here in Heidelberg did a very comprehensive research. Again, one may say, because we already did a similar thing during the Empowering project, but not as comprehensive as we did here. And we try to be very broad in terms of theoretical approaches to what would constitute a good listener. So of course we looked up work from classics like Carl Rogers. Clara Hill is a very well-known psychotherapy researcher who has done a lot of work on helping skills that show a great overlap with listening skills in the context of counseling and therapy. But we also looked at newer approaches, like, for example, motivational interviewing and things like that. From all these different sources, the interviews with the experts and with novices, but also the literature research, we came up with a long list of potential aspects on listening skills, and we developed 233 items. Now, those of you who are more familiar with psychology and psychology measurements know what items are. For the rest, I would just briefly explain that. An item is sort of a question in a questionnaire or a statement that one can agree with or disagree with to a certain degree. And so we formulated 236 statements where we asked participants to self-assess how competent they feel in this area. Now, of course, because there were so many sources, there was a lot of duplication in this material. And so the next step that we undertook was, no, I didn't see this change here, was that in January and to March 2020, we prepared a first online survey. And now we were very lucky that we had already planned to do this online because that was the time when the Corona pandemic started. But we were able to proceed because this part of the work was done online. And the goal of our first online survey was, out of these 236 items, to select the best, meaning the most informative items that would tell us most about the listening skills in the, as assessed by the perspective of the participants. And we also needed this first large online survey to extract the underlying dimensions, one could say, or factors in terms of psychometric language on listening skills. And so during the early summer or spring and early summer, we collected data in all the countries that participated in the project. And then we analyzed those data over the summer. And now here I want to show you for this first online survey how our participants or who our participants were. In total, we selected data from 714 individuals. Most of them were female, which is very common in psychological research, but also I think in the test context, as much as I have learned now over the last years. And here you can see how the participants are distributed over the countries. I hope that you can read those relatively small letters. NL stands for the Netherlands, IT for Italy, HU for Hungary, ES for Spain. Those were the provided the largest group of participants in the first survey, France, and E is, I think, for those few who chose to do the English presentation, because, and I forgot that D is for Germany, the bar on the far left. Now, I forgot to say that part of this development was to translate the questionnaire in all of these. So we developed it in English, and then we had to translate it in all the different languages. So we had 3, 4, 5, 6 translations, and of course we had to work in these translations because the meanings weren't always so clear, and some meanings changed over the translation, and so this was of course a back and forth development process. But now we had the questionnaire in 8 languages, English plus the 7 other ones, and that's how we collected the data. These participants were mainly volunteers working in TESS and telephone emergency services, but not all of them. We also recruited, or the participating partners actually recruited those online participants, and so we also recruited people who were interested in working in telephone emergency services before they had actually started. So those were, we considered novices. We also had responses from a few professionals. Those would typically be, for example, test post directors or trainers. And then we had professionals from other disciplines, because of course listening skills is not only something that you need in the test context, but also, for example, in counseling, psychotherapy, social services, or the like. And then we also had some participants who participated in the online surveys, and of course who had competencies more or less in listening, and but who were not actually involved in a classic listening skills field. And the sample was so diverse. It's something that we actually intended. We asked the participating partners to distribute it as widely as possible, because we wanted to see a range in and also in the distribution of listening skills and competencies. the participants were mainly working or retired. Those were the largest subgroups. And the other ones were slightly less represented, and they were relatively highly educated. Most of them had a college or university degrees and or at least an advanced secondary school, and very few had only a basic school degree. Now, the result of this first statistical data analysis that we were able to complete after these, or based on the data of these 714 participants, was that we were able to extract 8 different factors. This means that in this data, there were 8 different aspects or dimensions that make up listening skills, based on these items that we had developed and selected. And for each one of these 8 factors, we then, based on the statistical data and psychometric properties, we selected the most informative items, and we selected 8 items for each factor, so that we 8 times 8 came up with 64 items after the first evaluation. So this now, so now we had a much more handleable and a feasible questionnaire, because if you have to answer 236 items with a lot of duplication, that gets very annoying for the participants. But 64 items are much more usable and easier to answer. I will show the items in the end, but first I would continue with the progress of the intellectual output. We had another meeting in September 2020 that was actually a hybrid meeting, because then the corona pandemic was going on, and we weren't able to meet with the international group across countries. Country borders were closed at that time, and so the German participants met in Heidelberg. We were the host here, and the participants from the other countries joined via Zoom. That was a very productive meeting. We discussed the results of the first survey. We developed, we worked together for the development of names for these 8 factors, because now we had grouped items together. That was done by the statistics, but to actually make sense of it, we were very happy to confer with and to work together with the test experts. We also made preparations for the second online survey that we needed in order to finish the development process. So in the winter, or November to January last year, we had a second data collection, again in an online survey, again distributed by the partner institutions across the European countries that participated. And the goal of the second survey was first to replicate and confirm these 8 factors that we extracted during the first survey. So we basically asked, is this underlying structure that we are proposing now for what makes up listening skills, will this hold in another independent sample of participants? We also try to validate if what we measure actually or correlates with other indices of listening skills. So does the question, so validation always answers the question, does this questionnaire actually measure what we intend to measure? So now at the spring of this year, they analyzed the data for the second survey. We then developed a manual to interpret the results of the listening skills questionnaire that is sort of directed towards users and does not require any statistical knowledge. And then, of course, we wrote up our findings for our final report in the project. Now, based on our work, the other 2 intellectual outputs were able to start working, or the groups responsible for these other outputs were able to start working. And that is something that Stefan will talk about after my presentation. Again, a short overview over the second survey. This time we had 600 participants, which is fine. That those were was a slightly less, or the sample was a little bit smaller because we had so many or so few the items that we had to assess were a lot less. 64 versus 236 requires less participants. We again had a predominantly female sale, on average 58 years old. Again, Spain contributed most, and this time France, due to Elisabeth, also contributed a lot of participants. That was really good. And again, the largest participant group came from volunteers in the TESS context, but we also had a relatively or fairly large amount of professionals from other social contexts like psychotherapy, counseling, etc. You can see that in the slide. The average experience, or the average experience in listening, was 9 years. So there were many volunteers, for example, or professionals who had a considerable amount of experience in this field. Again, we had a high level of education, that's comparable to the first survey. Samples of both surveys are comparable, but we did make sure that there was not one person who filled out both surveys. So even though they are comparable, the surveys were done by completely independent samples by 2 different groups of people. So we were quite happy with these with the results of the second survey, because the 8 underlying factors were confirmed in the sample. And we were also able, because the psychometric properties were very good, we were also able to reduce the number of items again from 64 to now 48, which I think is now a very feasible length for a questionnaire. If you give 48 items out, that requires only a few minutes to fill in. So we think that is a good final questionnaire that we came up with. And now I would like to present the questionnaire to you, and also these 8 facets or aspects of listening. The order in which I present them now has nothing to do or has no, it doesn't indicate the importance. This is sort of a relative, it's a sort of a statistical order, but nothing meaningful. The first factor is made up of, we call this factor acceptance. And what we mean by that is an attitude of, that is to notice feelings, thoughts, and behaviors of oneself or others without judging. This may include having unwanted experiences that come and go without being inherently good or bad, and acknowledging that everyone's experience is valid and opinions are allowed to differ. So if that's the explanation that we gave for this question, for this dimension or this factor, and items that we use for its assessment, for example, are item 17, to truly accept it's sometimes hard for me. This is always the wording of the questionnaire, that we ask participants to indicate where they have trouble. And I can say a few words about that if you're interested in why we chose to word the questionnaire in terms of difficulties. But that's the decision we made for the whole questionnaire. So we always say it's sometimes hard for me. And now, for example, for acceptance, we ask to truly accept the other person's feeling or not to judge the other person. And then there's always a scale from it's very hard or not at all hard for me to do this. The second factor is the encouragement of behavioral change. And by that, we mean to be able to motivate other people, to engage them in action goals, encourage them to take responsibility. It also includes a positive attitude towards change and the talent to pass that attitude on to others. And example items are, it's sometimes hard for me to challenge the other person to take responsibility or to encourage the other person to solve problems. The third factor we call exploration. By that we mean techniques to help other people or other persons to tell their story, create a deeper understanding. It includes asking open questions and prompting reflections. And example items are, it's sometimes hard for me to invite, item 37, to invite the other person to become open to inner experiences or to encourage the other person to reflect upon feelings. Factor 4 is paraphrasing meaningful contents. By that we mean the ability to include to extract the most important context from what the other person said and to summarize their main statements, contains the ability to grasp what is important and to paraphrase that in one's own words. And so example items are, it is sometimes hard for me to pick out the highlights of the content expressed by others or to summarize statements of the other person. So you see there's some overlap here in the way that we frame these items, but those items together make up a very reliable factor. The fifth factor is the fostering of strength and resources. By that we mean that if one can motivate other persons by highlighting their abilities, developing manageable action steps, by asking for strengths and resources, as well as validating for the strength, the other one for the strength that you see in them. And that is sample items are, it is sometimes hard for me to offer a new perspective or to ask the other person for their strengths and resources. Factor 6 is emotional understanding, a skill that comprises reflecting on the emotional component of the other person's message, understanding feelings, even if not stated directly. It is sometimes hard for me to sense the emotional component of what the other person says, or to connect the emotion with the reason for the emotion, or to listen for the underlying feeling. Factor 7 is taking the lead. That was something that we discussed. Also, the wording of the factor, something that we discussed in the group relatively intensely, and also a bit was also a bit contradictory, but it does make up an important or it is an important aspect of listening, and whether, for example, you are able to end a telephone call within a reasonable amount of time, or to sort of set boundaries that are necessary for a good listening experience. So what we said is that taking the lead is a skill that comprises finding the right amount of regulation in the listening process, such that the other person feels that they're in good hands, but doesn't feel too controlled or overpowered. It involves explaining rules and boundaries where necessary, but also steering the listening process when the other person is, for example, too talkative or doesn't leave space for the listener to intervene. So what we asked here is, it is sometimes hard for me to intervene when the other person is overly talkative, or to interrupt gently if the other person talks nonstop. Yeah. Last factor is the foster of agency and alliance. And those terms come sort of from the psychotherapy literature. And what we mean by that is the ability to foster agency and alliance is involving engaging the other person in the listening process, building a relationship even within a very short time frame of often only one call. It comprises the ability to respond to personal questions while keeping boundaries, and also without shutting the other person off. Contains reassuring the other person, creating a pleasant atmosphere in which the other one feels safe to share their struggles. So for there is items like, it's sometimes hard for me to reassure the other person, or to observe how the other person responds to a disclosure, or to develop a deeper interest for the other person. So again, this is the overview over the 8 factors that we came up with, and I'm sort of running out of time, but also I'm getting to a close. Just wanted to highlight to present the 8 factors again in an overview: acceptance, exploration, paraphrase, meaningful context, emotional understanding, and taking the lead. Are sort of, we sort of see them a little more together, and then a second cluster of listening aspects or competencies: foster strength and resources, foster agency and alliance, and encourage behavioral change.